Did you know that more men have walked on the moon than have played James Bond? We've got a great Guys radio show for you this evening. Our special guest is Mark A. Altman. He's written this book, Nobody Does It Better. It's an oral history of James Bond on Guys Radio, premiering this evening on KCAA here in sunny Southern California, though it's not too sunny today. We're on at 8 p.m. Pacific Time, 102.3, 106.5 FM, 1050 AM. The pod drops tomorrow worldwide. Guys Radio, thanks for your support. I hope you can join us. Stay safe, wash your hands, don't hoard that toilet paper.
It's Guy Radio. Here's your host, Robert Manni.
All right, welcome to Guys Radio. This is your host, Robert Manni, welcoming you to the show where men and women can be at their best and everyone wins. Guys Radio. I bring you information for you to consider, for you to think about, for you to maybe feel something for, and then maybe you'll do something about it. Maybe you'll take some action. Guys Radio. We have all types of different guests that I bring on, and they're all for your benefit and the benefit of my listeners. And I cull through a lot of different people because I just want to bring the best of the best with some interesting info for you because I know how busy everybody is. So this week, we've got a very special guest. His name is Mark A. Altman, and he's written a book with his writing partner, Edward Gross. And it's called Nobody Does It Better. The complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of James Bond. So it's this huge tome. It's like 700 pages, and it's all snippets from all the different people who worked on and around and in the whole entire package of James Bond films. And it's really fantastic, and I thought it would be pretty timely because No Time to Die, the last Bond film with Daniel Craig, is going to be out. And this is a perfect time to get this information out there. And I think the book's going to do very well because it was a lot of fun to read. It's one of those books where you don't have to read it from page one through it. You can just kind of pick around and read some of the quotes from some of the people. And it's really interesting stuff. And it's not just surface. It really gets into, the whole Bond thing. So I'm going to be talking to Mark about all the different actors who played Bond, the Bond villains, the Bond girls, the music, the whole thing. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's our what we have coming up on Guys Radio today. Let me do a little riffing before we start the show, though, and our interview. A couple of things. I started a new segment called Brushes with Fame, just a regular Guys Brushes with Fame. So in my time living in New York City and working in advertising, I ran into a lot of people who were celebrities, if you will, and just in my day-to-day life, not having to do with advertising, I ran into people, and sometimes it was in New York, but sometimes in other parts of the world. So I just have been one of these people who runs into other people, and they've been very random. So I'm going to talk about two of them today. Number one, Rudy Giuliani. Now, I've been to events with Rudy Giuliani when he was mayor, when I worked in the distilled spirit business on Stolichnaya and Bombay Sapphire, and he used to come to a lot of different events, and we had also some events at some of the cigar clubs, and he's a big cigar smoker. But anyhow, after his terms as mayor, and before he got involved with the whole Trump thing going on in the Ukraine, I was around the corner from my apartment in Harlem a couple of years ago, and Rudy was not in the news. And I'm just walking down the street, and all of a sudden, there's this guy standing there, two guys. And the one guy, I look at him, and he looks at me, and he breaks out this huge smile and waves at me. And I look, and it's Rudy Giuliani. And I'm like, what? It was just us, the three of us there. I'm like, hello, Mayor Giuliani. And that was it. And I kept walking. I'm like, what is he doing here? And why is he looking at me and smiling? Was he campaigning for one person? I don't know. But it was a weird brush with fame. And I didn't stop to talk to him or anything. I just was like, I was on my way someplace. I'm like, okay, Giuliani, got it. And that's how New Yorkers are. Nothing really phases them. So that's one. But he did have a smile on his face, I'll say that. I'll give you the flip side of that. And, everybody gets in different moods. We all have our days and our times where maybe we don't feel like interacting with people. But one time I was on an ad shoot and I was out in L.A. and I was at the Lowe's Hotel, I believe, in Santa Monica, and I was going out to get a cab. So I was standing right outside, and there was one person with me standing next to me, and it was Sean Penn. And Sean Penn, he's pretty diminutive. He's not a tall guy. And I looked at him. It was just the two of us. So I figured, hey, I always say hello to anybody if I see somebody that's recognizable like that. So I said, hey, Sean, how are you? I love your work. And he actually kind of backed up, and his face became kind of twisted and contorted and very uncomfortable. And he looked at me and he didn't say anything. And I'm like, all right, whatever. Maybe he has his mind on something, whatever. But so we waited kind of, it was a little bit unsettling standing there with him until my cab came, and then his car, I guess, whatever. But that was my other brush with fame for this week, Sean Penn. So anyhow, what else is going on? Well, we've passed our 400th show. I'm still here in San Diego, California after many years in New York City. I'm having a blast. And all things are good. So anyhow, Guys Radio, our special guest, Mark Altman.
It's Guy Radio.
We're back on Guys Radio. As I mentioned, we've got a very special guest. His name is Mark Altman. He's written a book about James Bond. James Bond. It's called Nobody Does It Better. And we're going to get into that in a moment. I just want to remind everybody that there's the last Bond movie with Daniel Craig is coming out, and it's supposedly spectacular, and it's like almost 3 hours long. And I heard it's great. And so everybody's anticipating that. But in the meantime, our special guest, Mark Altman, he is a TV showrunner, so he helps make TV shows happen. He's also a film and television writer-producer who most recently co-executive produced the TNT hit series. I hope you guys have seen it. It's very good. It's called The Librarians. He also previously co-authored The 50-Year Mission, Vampires and Slayers and Vampires, rather, and So Say We All with his writing partner, Edward Gross. Slayers and Vampires is about the TV business, and So Say We All is about Battlestar Galactica. And so Mark's a cool guy. He's from the East Coast. He's out in California now, and I'm so thrilled because this book, it's a big book. It's 700 pages long. I flipped through it. It's an oral history, and it's a lot of fun. It's got everybody's opinion on Bond. All the players are in there, and it's really great job, and I can't wait to get started with our special guest on Guys Radio, Mark Altman. Welcome, Mark. How are you?
I'm great, Robert. Thanks for having me on the show. I always like talking about Bond, James Bond.
Let's start at the beginning. So you were obviously a true Bond aficionado, and I know your favorite movie is A Spy Who Loved Me, and I just watched that with my wife the other day, and you know what? It was fantastic, and we'll get into that. But what originally drew you to Bond, and to the point where you wanted to build a 700-page book about him?
Well, look, I want to just clarify, because my favorite Bond movie is From Russia with Love. My favorite Roger Moore movie is Spy Who Loved Me. Okay. So, but I love Spy Who Loved Me. But it goes to your question, which is a great question. I grew up in the 70s in Brooklyn and loved, a lot of genre stuff. My parents took me to see The Man with the Golden Gun. Arguably not one of the better James Bond movies, but I fell in love with Bond movies. It was just, we're globe-trotting. There was what's now called James Bond Island. It's stunning. Christopher Lee as the villain who charged $1 million a shot. It captured my imagination, even though now it's probably one of my least favorite Bond movies. And, a couple years later, Spy Who Loved Me comes out in the summer of 1977 and absolutely blew me away. Submarine cars, a giant, villain with a base that comes up from under the water, Barbara Bach in, bikini. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, it was my gateway drug into Bond. And, I just, from that point on, anything I could get my hands on, the Ian Fleming novels, later on it would be Stephen Rubin's The James Bond Films book. And there was, of course, The Bedside Companion by Raymond Benson. So I just fell in love with Bond movies. I've always loved them. And, every time I do one of these oral histories, I'm always say to Ed, I said, I'm done. This is my last one. I'm done. And we finished our last book on Battlestar Galactica. I said, hey, it's been a great run, Ed, but I'm done. And he's like, well, no, we got to do another one. I'm like, well, there's nothing else left to write about that I'm interested in. Well, of course, maybe James Bond, but we're not going to. And he, without telling me, went to our agent, and she said, "Oh, Mark wants to do it. Mark wants to do a James Bond book." It sold like that, and then all of a sudden, I found myself writing a James Bond book, and I'm thrilled because it was a really great experience. Probably my favorite of the books.
So what is it about James Bond? Why do we love him? We know he's a paid assassin. He's got a lot of flaws. He's a womanizer. He's totally anti Me Too right now. Even though when the series began, it wasn't the same issue, if you will. But this is a flawed guy. Is that why we love him? What is it about James Bond? I know he came out of England at a time where things were very dreary back there, and
yes,
he represented kind of their flashy, more sophisticated, bountiful past, if you will. But what is it that has made him such an enduring character that everybody loves and connects with so much?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what's the old expression? The sun never sets on the British Empire. Of course,
Right.
It did. So their connection to the past, to the glory days of England, are James Bond, where he's still at the center of the world and in the center of the action, so to speak. And I think one of the things that really appealed to people, you certainly look at the 60s when air travel wasn't as ubiquitous. People didn't have really didn't travel as much. So it was a way to experience the world, whether it was Istanbul or Jamaica, the Bahamas. And it was amazing because he was going to all these great places. He was drinking. He was, hooking up with all these beautiful women. So, what wasn't to like? I mean, there's that old expression, men wanted to be him and women wanted to be with him. And I think at its core, that is still the appeal of James Bond, even though he may be rough around the edges and he's very damaged and, certainly he's, a character in a great deal of pain and there's a huge amount of darkness in that character, but still, there's something very appealing about the "quote-unquote" James Bond lifestyle. He stays in the best hotels, he drives the best cars. He always seems to have whatever money he needs. There's something very appealing. And at the end of the day, he does the right thing. And is bringing down these supervillains, and I think that's one of the things that people really adore about Bond. I mean, I would say it's certainly one of the things I think attracted me to the character.
Good answer. Let's talk a little bit about the books versus the movies, because I had a real eye-opener. I'd seen all the movies, and then I went back and I picked up a copy of Casino Royale, and I read it, and I was like, wow, this guy can write, number one. I thought Ian Fleming's a terrific writer, and some people don't consider him, but I really was turned on by his writing, and then I got into His Majesty's Secret Service, and I started reading the books in the order of how they were rated as books. Tell us a little bit about your experience reading the books, Mark, and also how do you think the process went translating the books to the movies? Because some of the books Ian Fleming wouldn't allow. I don't know which one it was.
Spy Who Loved Me. He wouldn't.
Spy Who Loved Me. He wouldn't allow that plot to go into the movie. For maybe you can explain why. And then also, I think at the end when he wrote Octopussy, and then I don't know if it was You Only Live Twice, where they were short stories.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the dynamic between the books and the movies.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting about Spy Who Loved Me was it was told in a very unique format. There are 3 sections to that book, her, him, and them. And so it really is told from the perspective of this woman who is kidnapped by these thugs. And then James Bond shows up at this hotel. It's very, breaks format. It's very untraditional. It was not particularly successful, although it's actually a very good book. As a result, Ian Fleming said, you can have the title, but you can't keep the you can't do anything in the story. Although the character of Jaws and also the character of the other henchmen are loosely based on the characters in that book. So it's not 100% true that they didn't use anything. It definitely was an inspiration to a certain extent. But what you see early on is that there's a faithfulness to the books that starts to go away. By the time the Bond movies start to get bigger and more epic, by the time you get to You Only Live Twice, they start really discarding the book. There's not a lot there. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service goes back using it's probably the most faithful of all the adaptations. And then, starting with Diamonds Are Forever, it's a free-for-all. It's like, maybe they can take a scene. For Your Eyes Only has a scene from Live and Let Die, and it has a scene from, but there's not a lot. And they use the titles, but, Moonraker, obviously, when it was written, it was so, by the time they make it in 1979, there's nothing about it that would feel groundbreaking or fresh or modern. So I'm completely something different. But I really enjoy the books. I actually feel like it'd be really interesting to see Netflix or somebody do an adaptation of the books, like the James Bond, it's set in the '60s, and do faithful adaptations of the books. Not that they would necessarily be better than the movies, be really interesting.
That is a great idea. I would watch that, and I think lots of people would be interested in that because the books are fantastic, and the writing is very good. There's the whole, what does the main character want? Why can't he get it? The Bond. Let's get on to Bond a little bit because this is a character, when you read the books, you don't really know that much about him, kind of the backstory, or not the backstory, about who he's like inside. It's more through his actions, and he seems kind of like this rough, ruddy kind of guy. Yet he is been interpreted by, I don't know if it's 5 or 6 different actors, where you had Connery did 5, and then you had Lazenby, who was the one and done, and then that led to more. He started with Spy Who Loved Me, and then you went Dalton, Bronson, and Craig. And they all, to me, having read the books, they all had a different aspect. For me, and I'd love to get your opinion on this whole Bond character, as well as your favorite. I thought he looked like Dalton in the book, but he acted like Craig. What's your take?
Yeah, it's so funny because every time there's a new Bond, they always say, this is the most faithful to, Ian Fleming. I mean, I love all the interviews at the time, when Roger Moore was cast. Well, this is really James Bond, and you see it every time they can. And then was Timothy Dalton. This is the faithful adaptation that, Ian Fleming. But I think you kind of nailed it. I mean, I think, if you really look at it, Dalton had read the books, that he used them as his Bible, Craig, although not necessarily physically, but in terms of the performance, is very similar to what, Ian Fleming describes. People forget, I mean, Sean Connery, who is my favorite Bond, is not necessarily, Ian Fleming didn't love the casting of Sean Connery, and he came to appreciate him. But he really is, Terrence Young, the director's idea of what James Bond is. I mean, he created James Bond, in a sense, by teaching Sean Connery how to move, how to eat, how to order the best wines, how to dress, and it was like a weird, perverse version, not perverted, but perverse version of like My Fair Lady. Terrence Young sort of minted, Bond out of Connery. Connery was like this clay that he sculpted. Because, he was a blue collar bodybuilder. He was Jack LaLanne. And it was Terrence Young that turned Sean Connery into what he became, which is this movie icon, this legend. This amazing role. And then what I love about, look, and I, like a lot of people, really love On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and don't bag on Lazenby. The biggest problem Lazenby had was they were trying to do Sean Connery light, and can capture that kind of charisma. So what I love about Roger Moore is they didn't try and cast someone who was another Sean Connery. They went in a completely different direction. And what Roger Moore did is super fun, and it was so super suited for the '70s, light, fun, over the top, a little campy, and then you get to Timothy Dalton and the pendulum swings back to a more edgy, darker, gritty kind of James Bond. And then the same thing happens again. Pierce is more in the Roger Moore vein, and then swings back with Daniel Craig again to, the Connery Dalton vein. It's very interesting. It's a self-correcting franchise. They always know where they go too far, and then they manage to sort of do a chiropractic adjustment to where it needs to be. So you can go from Moonraker to Fear Eyes Only, or you can go from the dreadful Die Another Day to Casino Royale. I mean, it's really remarkable, how the franchise manages to know when it's gone too far and make that right turn back and get back on the track.
Guys Radio, your host, Robert Manni, with our special guest, the writer Mark A. Altman. His writing partner is Edward Gross. Nobody Does It Better, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of James Bond. So I remember Q in your book says that people, their favorite James Bonds are usually the one they saw first.
Right.
Do you agree with that? I think it's true. What do you think?
I think there's a truth to that. I mean, I say the same thing about Star Trek. A lot of times your favorite captain is the one you grew up on, right? So I think there's a truth to it. I mean, I have to say, Roger Moore was the first Bond I ever saw, but Sean Connery is my favorite. Mm-hmm. But I think largely that's true. You see it particularly with millennials who grew up either watching Pierce or Daniel. Those are their favorites. Whereas, someone like us, it's going to be Sean Connery or Roger Moore. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. And also their favorite Bond movies. Like, I mean, I think A View to a Kill is an absolute abomination. It's awful. But, for a lot of people, in sort of that Generation Y, that was their first movie and they love it. That was their first Bond movie. And they just think A View to a Kill is the cat's pajamas.
That was Christopher Walken
and Grace Jones and Patrick McNee. Yeah. And Duran.
That's right. So it seemed to me that, having watched A Spy Who Loved Me the other night, I was like, wow, he really took a step. He really seamlessly more got into the role, and he didn't go off like he did in like Octopussy and some of the others. Was that purposely done, like as a first step? He had he followed Lansby, and then he steps into the role, and it seemed like a pretty prototypical James Bond movie in the Sean Connery mode, with a little twist, a little more wink of the eye, but he wasn't pastiche as he kind of got further down the line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's interesting because if you look at Sean Connery, most people would say his third film was his best, his Goldfinger, where he really nails it, right? And it was kind of with Roger Moore. It was his third film where he really nails it. I think it's interesting because Live and Let Die did well. Man with the Golden Gun did not do well, not particularly well, and they knew the franchise. It looked cheap, it felt cheap. Broccoli and Saltzman were sort of having their divorce, the professional divorce, and when Broccoli had the franchise, they knew they had to go big, and so they take all the huge epic set pieces of something like You Only Live Twice with the underwater base and the submarine car, and they throw everything at this movie, and it was Roger Moore's favorite of his Bond movies. It's certainly my favorite of his Bond movies. I wouldn't say it's grounded because it's pretty fanciful and spectacular, but it doesn't go over the top in the way that, say, Moonraker does. And there's just there's a lot of heart to it. I mean, there's a scene where Barbara Bach's Major Amasova comes up to him and they start trading sort of witty bon mots, and then she mentions his dead wife, and he sort of takes a step back, and she's sensitive about some things, yes, and it's a really solid, grounded performance from Roger Moore. He's very believable, he's very credible, he's funny, and the globetrotting. I mean, Egypt never looks more beautiful in a movie.
Right.
Obviously, all the
skiing at the beginning,
Sardinia.
Opening.
I mean, it's just amazing. The skiing scene right at the beginning is, probably the most memorable opening to any Bond movie, and one of the best songs too. And Carly Simon's "Nobody Does It Better." Make a great title for a book.
Very good, Mark. So let's get into the villains a little bit. What makes a great Bond villain, and who do you think were the best ones?
Yeah, that's a good question. With the villains, I think somebody has to be formidable. I think if you look at something like Quantum of Solace, despite what a great actor Matthew Almeric is, he doesn't really resonate for people because he's not really physically threatening. He his plan is a little Looney Tunes. You don't really understand it. He doesn't have a menacing henchman, and I think that's a reason why that movie isn't as well regarded as some of the other films. Obviously, Gert Frobe's Goldfinger maybe isn't physically threatening to Bond, but he has a plan. He's super capable. He has a henchman you can't mess with, and he's able to come back at Bond. When Bond says, "Oh, I wonder what the club secretary would have to say after Odd Job he decapitates the statue."
Right.
He says, "Nothing. I own the club, Mr. Bond." So when you can banter with Bond and keep it's great. So he's a real threat to Bond, and when he captures him, in Kentucky, and you're really worried about what's going to happen to Bond. So that's great. I love Dr. No. I thought Joseph Wiseman gives a great performance. He's really terrific in that. The best villain. I missed opportunity was Christopher Walken. He seems like he was born to play a Bond villain, and yet that movie doesn't really work. Obviously, I like a lot of the iterations of Blofeld. It's such a great character. In a way, he was the original Thanos because they keep teasing him, petting the cat. You don't see his face in a couple of movies. And then finally, in Infinity War, a.k.a. You Only Live Twice, you meet Blofeld. And that's Donald Pleasance, and he's great. So those are all, terrific villains to me.
How did you work with Edward, and how did you compile a book, and how did you get these sound bites?
Well, with Ed, we sort of divided up. He took certain chapters. I took certain chapters. I tried to take, I guess, the 70s and 80s, and then eventually we flip. but like I started with the 70s, 80s. I started with the introduction. I started with the end. He took, the 60s, and then he took the 90s. And then we flip and we rewrite each other. We obviously interviewed a ton of people for this book. And then there were a bunch of people in the past that we had interviewed. I had to talk to Tom Mankiewicz shortly before he died for a piece I was doing for Cinefantastic that never happened. And so I probably had about 3 hours with him that I'd never used for anything. So it was such a resource. Same thing with Ed. I mean, Ed had spent, been on the set of a lot of Bond movies and used a fraction of that material for freelance gigs that he'd done in the past. So we had access to a ton of material. And then, of course, there were some people who were deceased that we couldn't get a hold of that we were able to supplement it with material that Richard Schenkman was able to give us, which was a super fantastic, because we didn't have, couldn't, obviously Kevin McClory's passed away, and there were one or two other people like that too. So we were really grateful to him, sharing some of his material to sort of fill in some of the holes, where we didn't have people.
Okay, you got some good sound bites, Daniel Craig and some of the other Bonds. How did you get to them? And also, did these guys, do they know each other? Did they ever appear? Because, we've even seen past presidents all standing together for a photo, but you don't really see too much with the Bonds. Were they competitive? Yeah. Were they jealous? Were they buddies? Were they respectful of one another? What was your sense from doing your
it's
work?
It's not like, it's always something special about, no matter how much you hate some presidents and love some presidents, when they're all standing together, like at a funeral or something, it's always, there's something really special about it, right? With Bond, I think most of them have left on pretty bad terms, other than Roger Moore, and Timothy Dalton to a certain extent. So you don't really see, and Sean Connery and Roger Moore were friends for a long time, still are, but until Roger passed away. But you don't really see them together, like Bond, any kind of Bond events for like the 50th, where all the Bonds, are coming together. It's just not. It's sort of like out of sight, out of mind. Like, sort of when, Pierce left under, unpleasant circumstances, he got a phone call from them saying, hey, we're going in another direction. Thanks for everything, and he was really, hurt and upset. He didn't think, he was done as Bond. He was, usually it's the actor that could,
right.
And it was, Dalton, they handled as well as they could, but even Dalton, the Broccoli family had wanted to keep Dalton around for another couple of pictures, and it was the studio that's like, he's done, after License to Kill and all the litigation. And then, they weren't even sure the franchise was viable in the early 90s. They said, this is your father's show. And then we're not even sure kids know who Bond is. And one of the things they were adamant about was recasting Dalton with Pierce, and, the Broccolis, sort of had to give into that. So there was, so there's not a lot. They don't get together for like Bond reunions and all sit there. It wasn't great playing James Bond.
It's not like The Sopranos, right?
Ill feelings,
So let's just go through how the main characters left. So Connery, from what I could tell was he felt like he was undervalued and didn't get the money. The producers were making all the money, and he was kind of done with it. Because the reason I ask this question is I always get this anxiety when I see Daniel Craig, read about him and stuff like, oh no, I'd rather get stabbed in the eye than do another Bond movie. Yeah. And then they throw 30 million at him or whatever. But tell us about how each one of these, you kind of did in your last answer, but just real quickly.
Sure.
Connery to Lazenby to Moore to Dalton to Bronson to Craig.
Yeah, it's always a fascinating story because they've all left for different reasons. You look at Sean, and Sean saw basically Broccoli and Saltzman owned, like half. They saw half the profits for that. I mean, they were making so much money on the Bond movies, and Sean was getting paid a lot, but he felt like he should be a partner as well. He wasn't getting that kind of money, and he felt that they didn't value him. And Sean is somebody who feels like he needs to be valued. He needs to be paid what he's worth. And, one of the reasons they were able to get him back for Diamonds Are Forever is they just threw a ton of money at him. And it was really United Artists that did it because he wasn't really talking to Broccoli and Saltzman. And so, he said, if they had treated me the way you are, United Artists, maybe I would have stayed. And he knew he had him over a barrel because after he left, after You Only Live Twice, and you got to admit, also he was exhausted because he was doing a picture a year initially, 62 Dr. No, 63 From Russia with Love, 64 Goldfinger. I mean, it's insane. Now sequels take 3 years sometimes, 4 years. 5 years between Bond movies, they were doing a Bond movie, a classic Bond movie every year. So for an actor who wanted to stretch his acting muscles and do other things, it was very difficult because these were long and tiring shoots. And by the time he gets to You Only Live Twice in Japan, where he is like the Beatles over there, and they're going crazy and following him into bathrooms, and he can't have any privacy. He's done. He's checked out. He's not getting paid enough. The shoots go on too long, and he's being harassed everywhere he goes. He doesn't want that. So then they hire Lazenby, and then Lazenby gets sold a bill of goods by his manager. This guy who was involved with Radio Caroline and real sick. He says, "Oh, James Bond's over. This is the '60s. It's the time of Easy Rider and stuff. And you don't want to be, with this associated with this square character." So basically, he shows up at a premiere, with a beard and looking like a hippie and not like James Bond at all. Right before the movie opens, so there's no love lost there between the producers or him with them. And he walks away. They let him go, and they pull up the Brinks truck to Sean Connery. They get him back from a movie.
Right
now, it's Roger Moore. Roger Moore was there, for a long time. But the interesting thing about Roger is, he always threatened to leave as a negotiating tactic. Well, I'm done. I think I'm done. My contract's over. And then they offer him more money, and he comes back. And arguably he came back one time too many with A View to a Kill. But finally, he's in his late 50s, and it's like,
right.
How are you going to bring him back? And even he knew it was over, and he did not like doing A View to a Kill. And they hired Timothy Dalton. Timothy Dalton is kind of the first Bond to be shown the door, not because he wants to leave, but because that was the story at the time. Timothy Dalton decides he's going to leave, but he was really shown the door, and that was sort of a way for him to leave with dignity. And then, with Pierce, it's worse because Pierce does the 4 movies, and they basically, after Die Another Day, they get the rights to Casino Royale back. They feel they can't do that, the birth of Bond with Pierce because he's done 4 movies. So they call him and say, "You're done." Now, there are 2 sides to that story. Pierce basically says, I was shown the door unceremoniously. The producers say that his agents were asking for like $40 million and it was outrageous and they weren't going to pay him. It really depends on who you believe, right? And maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. And then Daniel Craig comes. He does a couple of movies. Casino Royale is beloved. People don't like Quantum of Solace. Even he doesn't like it. Does Skyfall, which is, even though there's some fans that hate it, for the most part, it's considered one of the greats, right? And then Spectre, no one likes.
Right. And
he has that famous comment, "I'd rather slit my wrist than do another one."
Right.
But apparently, $3 million and first dollar gross fixes a lot of bloodletting, and he comes back for one more movie. But he got pretty beat up physically on this, and he's under the microscope. And I think this is it. He's done. I mean, he's pretty much said he's done.
What about the music, Mark? How does the music get chosen? And more importantly, how come the Stones have never done a Bond theme?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for you. It seems so obvious.
The British, Jagger, right?
They would be so perfect, or at least have Mick Jagger do it. Even if you don't get the Stones, he had a solo career in the 80s. Such as it was. And it's very interesting because, but they were always never really in touch with like what great music was, because, when Live and Let Die, when George Martin sends over a demo of Live and Let Die from Paul McCartney, they're like, "Hey, this is a good song. Who should we get to sing it? Frank Sinatra or someone?" and they're like, no. If Paul is giving you the song, but he will sing it. And they're like, "Oh, well, we don't know if we want Paul McCartney." They said, "There is no song without Paul McCartney." And so they start playing it for people, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, Paul McCartney singing a Bond song is amazing." Right. Then they start to say, "We got Paul McCartney." It's so funny. They didn't even realize what they had because they were, kind of 40s and 50s, and just they did not get what a huge coup it was to get Paul McCartney. And of course, that song's been covered a million times. It's one of the best, if not the best, James Bond song. But and then since then, they've had mixed success chasing the hot young thing, like Aha, which was huge in the 80s, Take on Me, Living Daylights. Is that a memorable Bond song? Depends who you ask, but it certainly didn't go to the top of the charts. Duran Duran, much more successful, huge successful in the 80s, huge band, and the main title is successful. License to Kill, awful, barely memorable. And then you have this,
Jones, remember Tom Jones way
Alicia
back.
Keys and White do
Adele.
Adele is huge. Adele is the biggest one in a long time. And now Billie Eilish, who's a hot young thing, is doing the new Bond.
Have you heard the new song?
I have not. Have you?
No, I was surprised because I haven't, I got into Post Malone and I've been listening to Cage the Elephant with my son and stuff, but I haven't wrapped my head around Billie Eilish yet. And I'm like, I don't get it. It's going to take me a little while. Sorry, I'm a boomer. All right. So
it's funny for me. Billie Eilish is it's kind of like he's very depressing. It's very low energy. So I'm very curious to see what she does. There's so many what ifs that we missed. It's like had Amy Winehouse not died, she was going to do Quantum. Like how great would that have been?
Yeah,
been awesome.
She was.
And then there are a bunch of songs they rejected. There's an Alice Cooper song they rejected, which is awful. But then there was a really great Fear Eyes Only song that Blondie did. That would have been cool. Although obviously Sheena Easton's Fear Eyes Only was one of the bigger hits. Is a wonderful song.
How about the opening sequences and then the women? Who is this separate from the current director on the film? Is this a Broccoli thing? How does that get? How does the opening
you
sequence?
Want the job. You're trying to get the job. You're sending your resume to shoot the opening credits.
Because it seems like that's a Bond staple, and then the movie's the movie, but it seems like there's a whole other thought process that goes into those opening sequences.
Yeah, it exists completely outside of the actual movie. The directors basically get to say, hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking, but that stuff's done while the movie is filming. And obviously for the first bunch of years, it was Maurice Binder, and then Robert Brownjohn did too. But Maurice Binder became famous for doing these opening credit sequences that were so memorable. And once he dies, you have another guy called... oh my God! I interviewed him for the book. How do I not remember? Oh, well, Daniel Kleinman, who comes out of advertising, who's fantastic. He does Casino Royale, which is truly inspired and different.
Very good.
Quantum of Solace is Mark Forster's guy, the director. He used the MK, another advertising agency. But then Kleinman comes back with his most spectacular one yet, which is Skyfall, which is amazing. And of course, he did the Pierce ones too. I mean, when he did GoldenEye, because Maurice Binder died. So License to Kill was his last one. Then Kleinman does GoldenEye, which is stunning. And this is kind of at the early stages of CGI. So a lot of it is, all these Russian, Soviet icons being destroyed. And it's just amazing. Tomorrow Never Dies. It's okay. The world's not enough. But then Casino Royale is really imaginative. And then Skyfall is spectacular. And Inspector's probably his weakest since Tomorrow Never Dies. But he's such a great guy. It was so great to talk to him. Such interesting insights, and such a big Bond fan. Had a lot to say about Maurice Binder and about doing these, and how some directors have more to say than others.
Right.
And particularly on Tomorrow Never Dies, is the director Roger Spottiswoode that apparently no one really liked, and his input was useless. Kind of in his estimation.
Okay. How about the Bond women? There's usually it seems like there's a Bond girl who's like the good girl, and then there's one that's a little more sexy, and sometimes she gets knocked off. What's it? Is it a good thing if you're an actress? Is this a good springboard? Are you forever labeled as the Bond girl, or what's your take and your personal take on the whole Bond girl thing?
Well, I think it's evolved because I think in the 60s, basically they only wanted to cast gorgeous women, and then they would dub them whether they could act or not. I mean, Ursula Andress, is dubbed, but who remembers how she sounded, right? It's like, and then you have Danielle Bianchi, who also is dubbed, and one of my favorites, and Claudine Auger in Thunderball, who probably is my favorite Bond girl, and she's dubbed as well. So a lot, and then you only have twice the two women in that. Aki is there's a little, so then they're only concerned really about how these women look. Now in the 70s, they're still. You have at least they stopped being dubbed. Like Jill St. John, very
right,
good in Donna
Wood, right.
But they're still, even though she's a smuggler and a jewel thief and all this stuff, still she's eye candy, right? I mean, she's wearing a bikini most of the time, and that's a nice little nothing you have on when he first meets her. You start to see more, and then Britt Eklund, who's probably one of the worst of the Bond girls in Golden Gun. But then with Barbara Bach, she is Agent Triple X. She's a killer. She's his opposite number in the KGB, and so now women are starting to become stronger characters.
Right.
And so, I love Barbara. Who doesn't love Barbara Bach? I mean, she's married to Ringo Starr. She's gorgeous. She's great. And then you have Lois Charles in Moonraker, who's an astronaut. So theoretically, they're getting a little more agency, as the kids say. And then you get the Fear Eyes Only, also another strong female character. But it's really now, more recently, where I think being a Bond girl is not necessarily something that is like, oh, you were a Bond girl, and then because Halle Berry, who had won an Oscar, comes in and is a Bond girl. Eva Green's career is certainly not hurt. If anything, it's helped by playing a Bond girl, and she's fantastic. Olga Kurylenko, it didn't hurt or help really. So I think that the days of it being something that hurts your career, which it did early on, I think, because you were just considered eye candy and not necessarily a great actor, has changed. So I think it definitely has, evolved with the times. And the roles have evolved, where they're much stronger characters, much more empowered, and basically don't tolerate Bond. Because even though Bond doesn't evolve, he's a sexist, misogynist dinosaur and always is and always should be. The women call him out on it, which is the difference now.
Okay. Our special guest on Guys Radio is Mark A. Altman. He wrote this book called Nobody Does It Better, The Complete, Uncensored, Unauthorized Oral History of James Bond. His writing partner is Edward Gross. Just a couple more questions, Mark. You've been fantastic. When you were working on this book and learning about the whole history of James Bond, what's something that stood out like, wow, I never thought or expected that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, for me personally, one of the most fun interviews was talking to Woody Allen about Casino Royale 67, which was, a disastrous movie creatively, although it was fairly successful. And, it's a movie that, Woody's kind of, totally embarrassed by. So I was amazed that he talked to me. So from a personal perspective, that was interesting. From stuff I learned about Bond, certainly the fact that after License to Kill didn't do well, that the studio had lost faith in Bond so much that they weren't even sure they wanted to make another Bond, and that they kind of internally, sort of gave GoldenEye a very low budget because they weren't convinced that anyone would go see it. And it was a combination of a brilliant marketing campaign and the success of the Nintendo video game that really introduced Bond to a whole new audience, a younger audience, because there was this feeling that Bond was something, for boomers and the high end of Gen X, and that everyone else didn't care. And, thankfully, they were either proved wrong or GoldenEye brought in a lot of new fans.
Mm-hmm. What do you see, Mark, as the template for a Bond movie, and how has that been extrapolated across Hollywood movies?
Yeah, well, what's great about Bond movies, even to this day, is generally they're in terms of the stunt work, and it tends to be stuff that they can do for real, which is something that Mission Impossible obviously ran with as well. Rather than just doing things strictly in CGI, they want stuff that are physically possible, even though, more and more it's enhanced by CG. Look at that brilliant parkour scene at the beginning of Casino Royale. I mean, yes, it's enhanced by CG, but you wouldn't know it. It's a lot of it's being done for real, which makes it grounded and believable, even as, crazy as everything that's going on.
Right.
I think it's one of the things people love about the Daniel Craig movies. They believe Daniel Craig can do this, because unlike Roger Moore, where he had his 16 stuntmen, you knew it wasn't Daniel Craig. It's like, insert stuntman here. Daniel Craig, you really feel like he's doing this, even if he's not. And
even though he doesn't tiptoe over crocodiles, though.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't tiptoe over crocodiles. That's for sure. Trespassers will be eaten. But I think that what's great is that there was a while there where Bond was sort of floundering, and you had stuff like Bourne Identity and Mission Impossible that stole its thunder, and it struggled to find its own identity because Quantum of Solace sort of became a Bourne Identity ripoff in a way, and then Bond starts to find itself again, with Skyfall, and it realized this is what we do, this is what it is, and it's still everybody's trying to knock off the king. Because even though these other great action franchises, there's a reason that Bond has been around for 50 plus years and probably will be for another 50.
Okay, last question, and you've been fantastic. I love it when I get a guest on the show who's very competent in his product and also very conversational. So thank you so much, Mark.
No problem.
Really, you're a guy's guy too, so I love that. Tell us anything you can about the new movie, No Time to Die, and then what's next in terms of who's the next James Bond, just from your own insights.
Yeah, look, like a lot of people, I don't know much about No Time to Die. Partially it's because I don't want to know. It's kind of like, I've had opportunities to find out more, but it's like there's nothing like walking into a Bond movie and knowing nothing about it, like when you're a kid and
Yep.
being like, just, oh my God, this is so cool. Like everybody, I saw the trailer and thought the trailer was phenomenal.
Very, very well done.
And I know all about the problems they had, and Danny Boyle walking away and Phoebe Waller-Bridge coming in to do a polish and stuff. But, I always go in with any movie, no matter what I've heard, hoping it'll be great, until it's not, and I always hope for the best. I'm not somebody who goes in all cynical thinking, and I, there certainly have been Bond movies where I went in with that attitude and walked out like that was awful, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think from everything we've seen, hopefully they leave it all on the field, and it's a great swan song for Daniel Craig. I
What do you think's
really
next?
think, based on the trailer, at least it looks great. But then the Spectre trailer was great, and that movie
Right.
is not very good.
Any sense of who's been the rumblings about who's next?
I don't think they really started thinking about that. I mean, there are two people in the studio who were going to make the decision, and that's Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, who are, the kids of Albert Broccoli and Dana Broccoli. And, the thing is, it's tough because they've been very smart in the past where they tried not to imitate themselves. A lot of people are saying, oh, it should be Henry Cavill. Henry Cavill is sort of the Daniel Craig, but not as good mode, right? So do you go with somebody like Tom Hiddleston, who's like more in the Roger Moore vein, who's so great in The Night Manager, who maybe isn't physically
Right.
but
Yeah, he's
there's
terrific in
something
that.
going on in the head,
Yeah.
where it's like a more of a Roger Moore or Pierce kind of thing. Or is it going to be somebody who's at Juilliard right now, or the Royal Academy of Shakespeare,
Right, gotcha.
that we don't even know who it is, which
Got
is
it.
fine with me, or they feel they got to cast a name, because that was a whole time in the 70s, after Lazenby doesn't work out, where they're thinking Burt Reynolds, thinking James Brolin, all these names who are totally wrong, who weren't even British. So it'd be very interesting to see where they end up. I just hope that they don't get stymied and hung up, and this becomes this 4 or 5 year thing, where they can't decide what to do. The one thing that frustrates me about the Bond movies, going back to where we started this conversation, was they were doing these every year, and then it became every 2 years, and it was like something you could count on. And now it takes so long between Bond movies, and it shouldn't. If there's one franchise you're going to be sequelizing, why they're not developing multiple scripts and getting ahead on this, and why a movie comes out, they're exhausted for 6 months, they
Great
start
point.
developing it, and then 5 years later the movie and I always say, if a movie comes out every year, you're a lot less demanding on it than if you've been waiting 5 years. The bar is
Right.
that much higher. It better be good, because I've been
Yep.
waiting 5 years for this.
Yeah. The thing that's amazing to me about the whole franchise is, as I'm reading your book and then thinking about all the different films, there's a lot of cooks that could have spoiled the broth, yet somehow every Bond movie has kind of a life of its own and still fits in somehow. Some are better than others, of course, as to be expected, but these could be really messy because when you have so many different points of view and so many changes made with directors pulled out, this and that. I know it happens in Hollywood all the time, but particularly for a franchise where in some ways there has to be a real template that's respected. There's been a lot of different players going in and out of this franchise, yet the product lives on. And I think that's the strength of Ian Fleming's writing, the original character, and just there's good stuff to work with.
And I think also the fact that it's a family business, I think the quality, whether you love them or don't, the Broccolis have maintained a certain quality that they, stand for pat against the studio. They haven't always made the right decisions, but I think they've helped ensure quality control and that the franchise doesn't become something that it isn't and doesn't get overexploited. And what I love is no matter how bad or good a Bond movie is, it's somebody's favorite.
Yep.
You could go through every movies that we can't stand, and someone's gonna say, that's my favorite Bond movie. And movies that we love, that's my least favorite. It's like, I love Daniel Craig. There are a ton of people out there can't stand Daniel Craig. I love Roger Moore. There are a ton of people can't stand Roger Moore. And then there are people who think Timothy Dalton's the best Bond. And I don't dislike Timothy. He's certainly not my top tier. So it's like, that's what makes horse racing. And that's what we tried to capture in the book. The sense of, the kind of conversations you have with your friends about this stuff. If you sat down and talked about Bond for, 8 hours, this is the conversation you might have. And hopefully we've done justice to that, and we pulled in a bunch of people who worked on all these movies. I say, the great thing about the oral history format, it's like the best dinner party in the world. You're sitting with like 500 people who worked on all these movies and just talking about it, and they're getting more and more drunk, and they start saying more and more things they shouldn't, and that's what makes these books so much fun.
No, the book is fantastic. Nobody does it better. The complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of James Bond by Mark A. Altman and Edward Gross. It's a lot of fun. This is a fun discussion, and the book is a lot of fun because you can read it from cover to cover straight through, or you can just flip around. And I did that, and I had a blast reading it. So great job, Mark, and thank you so much for being on Guys Radio.
There's also the audiobook if people want it for their commute, which is terrific. They got a bunch of Brit. It was so great. We auditioned, they actually sent us for our approval, and we're like, Brits, you got to hire Brits for the audiobook. So
you have a website?
It's like Audible and all that stuff. So, go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or any of these places. They have the book, the audio book, the Kindle book, the audio is all this stuff.
And Mark's other books, Slayers and Vampires, and So Say We All. And what was the Star Trek book?
The Star Trek book was the 2-volume 50-year mission, oral history of Star Trek. I'm very, very proud of those books as well. They were, probably as I say, brilliantly reviewed, but the best books about Star Trek since the making of Star Trek. So if you're a Star Trek fan, you should check it. Check out those books, The 50-Year Mission.
All right, Guys Radio with Mark A. Altman. Thank you so much. You really killed it today. I appreciate
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Robert Manni's The Guy's Guide to Love is a fast-paced tale of flawed men and savvy women competing for love, sex, power, and money in the city where they play for keeps. It's the men's successor to Sex and the City. The Guy's Guide to Love is a sexy romp through the fast-moving, high-stakes world of Madison Avenue. Available now on Amazon and wherever books are sold.
That was Mark Altman on Guys Radio talking about James Bond, the ultimate secret agent 007. Wow, so what did we learn? Well, we learned that there's a whole community around James Bond. It's a franchise. It's a $7 billion business. That's the gross of all of James Bond films combined. Absolutely amazing, and it's really the template and the source material, if you will, for, in my opinion, the Mission Impossible and a lot of other the movie franchises that are around now. Everybody kind of nicks a little bit from James Bond. Who was your favorite James Bond? For me, I agree with the character who played the actor who played Q. He said in the book, in Mark Altman's book, that the first James Bond you see is usually your favorite. So mine was Sean Connery, but I also think that Daniel Craig does a wonderful job, because if you read any of the James Bond books, he comes across more as kind of a rugged action guy. You don't really learn too much about who James Bond is between the ears, but he moves and he's in action a lot, and he's a very interesting character. So my favorites are Connery and Craig, although I thought Roger Moore, when he started out, he added something special to it. And then it got a little bit pastiche when he went into some of the films like View to a Kill and Octopussy, which were just, I was laughing when I watched those. Okay, Guys Radio. We're on KCAA Radio every Wednesday evening at 8 p.m. Pacific Time, 102.3, 106.5 FM, 1050 AM. The show rebroadcasts every Sunday at 2 p.m. here in sunny Southern California. Our podcast drops every Thursday, and we're on iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes / Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, CastBox. You can stream it on kcaa.com. We're on Blog Talk Radio, and also my website, robertmanni.com. You can stream from there. On my website, robertmanni.com, you'll find out a lot about the whole Guys movement, the source material being my novel, The Guy's Guide to Love, critically acclaimed and called by iconic 20th century author Dan Wakefield as the male successor to Sex and the City. It's about two dudes in advertising competing for love, sex, power, and money in the city where they play for keeps. NYC. Hey, you know what? I know nowadays two dudes rambling around in the city. Doesn't sound like very PC, but the women who've read my book, and most of the readers are women, all love the female characters. They love the two male characters, and they see them as evolved. And it's a story of awareness and redemption and realization. And it's a lot of fun, and it's a romp, and there's a lot of sex. So I hope you'll check it out. You can get 3 free chapters through my website, but also you can pick up the book on Amazon. If you want to support Guys Guys Radio, I would ask you to consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing on Apple Podcasts/iTunes. You can follow me, your host, Robert Manni, on Facebook, Twitter, all over social media, Instagram, YouTube, and I just found out that we're ranked in the top 100 in our category of podcasts in Australia. So that's kind of nice news. We're going to keep growing and growing and growing here on Guys Guys Radio. So as always, I thank my listeners, I thank my guests, and as I always like to say, we'll see you next week, and Guys Guys, finish first.